No one in the neighborhood knew what was really going on inside Miss Jefferson's old White House. She had let nobody inside for years, and as it would turn out, this was for a very good reason. Miss Jefferson was hiding something from the world, and when her neighbors finally found out what it was, they could never look at the old women the same again. The mystery of the house was something Taylor and her husband Joe were wondering about ever since they moved in next to the big White House. They had met their neighbor a few times now. Her name is Anna, and she is already 96 years old. But she was gone most of the times, and she often avoided contact. Until that lucky day where Taylor finally got to see the inside of the house. The mystery started in 2018 when Taylor and Joe moved into their new house. They had always lived in the city, but they decided they wanted a more quiet life. While they were carrying the boxes to their new home, Taylor looked at the old White House and got a strange feeling she was being watched. The old White House was around 80 meters away from their place. It looked quite old, and as if it had not been maintained for a while. They went to the other neighbors to ask if anybody was living in that big house, but they didn't quite get the response they expected. When they asked the question, the faces of their neighbors turned very serious. They said, "Yes, there's a 96-year-old lady called Anne who lives in the house all by herself. She has lived there for 50 years now, but ever since her husband mysteriously left around 20 years, she's been acting very strange. Since then, nobody but her has entered the house." Taylor and Joe decided they wanted to meet Anne. They walked towards the mysterious-looking house. The curtains were all closed, as they apparently have been for 20 years now. A very unusual feeling arose when they came closer to the house. They wouldn't admit it, but they were both feeling quite scared. Joe knocked on the old wooden door, and not long after, they heard someone approaching. Then a small hatch in the door opened, and they saw two intriguing eyes and very wrinkled skin. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" they heard the old lady say. "We are your new neighbors," Taylor said cheerfully. "And we'd love to get to know you better," she added. "Okay, but you're not coming in. I'll come to your house. I'll be there in 15 minutes, replied the woman. She sounded irritated. Joe and Taylor walked back towards their own place. The neighbors were right. This old lady is definitely quite strange. Why wouldn't she invite us in her house? Not long afterwards, they saw the old lady approaching their house. She wore dark clothes and her face looked as if it had not shown a smile for years. The old lady entered the house, and although Taylor and Joe were a bit scared of how this would go, it was actually a very nice conversation. Anna was a very polite old lady and told them lots of stories from back when she first moved into her house. But everything changed when Taylor asked if they could go to Anna's house sometime. Taylor tried to ask the question as calm and polite as possible, but Anna's face changed from smiling to very agitated. Instead of beating around the bush and looking for an excuse, Anna blatantly said, "No, never. And I don't want you ever ask me that question again." Anne left almost immediately after this confrontation. She clearly had no intention to spend more time with Taylor and Joe, even though so far it had been a nice and warm meeting. As quick as the 96-year-old lady could, she walked back to her house. Joe and Taylor were shocked and confused. Why was she so angry all of a sudden? What was she hiding in that house? Joe and Taylor looked at each other and sighed. Was moving here a big mistake? They would have loved to have a good relationship with their neighbors, but it was just their first day, and it already seemed like their relationship with Anna was destroyed. But one thing they knew for sure, they had to find out what was going on in the house. Taylor decided to start keeping an eye on the neighbor a bit more, and she started noticing more and more strange behavior. Whenever Anne left the house, she quickly closed the door and looked around if nobody had seen her. Also, she started going out more than she did before, but Taylor had no idea where she was going. But the weirdest thing Taylor noticed was a black van arriving at the house every week on Saturday. They would park next to the house. She knew Joe wouldn't allow her to do that, so she did not tell him beforehand. She had seen Anna leave her house, and she figured she had at least 3 hours before she would return. She put on dark clothes and walked towards the house. First, she tried to see if the front door was unlocked, but unfortunately it wasn't. Then she decided to try her luck at the back of the house. Taylor tried 2 of the doors at the back of the house, but these were both also locked. She was disappointed. She hoped things would be easier. She almost decided to give up and leave, but then she saw that she hit the jackpot. Taylor noticed a small window which was left open. She figured that with a bit of luck, she might fit through. The window was on the first floor, so Taylor couldn't reach it by herself. She would have to find something to climb on. She looked around and noticed an old barrel in the garden. Taylor rolled it over and then she put it right under the window. But she still wouldn't make it. She needed to be a little bit higher. Old ladder. Taylor was shocked and let out a scream. Luckily, she held on tight, otherwise she could have fallen badly. But now she had to use all her strength to pull herself up and crawl through the window. And she will have to think of a new route for the way back. Taylor crawled slowly through the window and plopped down on the old wooden floor. She looked around, saw nothing strange. She might have expected the house to look more dilapidated from the inside. But this was only the first room she saw. She had no idea what she would find in the rest of the house. She saw that this room was pretty much unused. Everything was dusty, and there were only a few boxes of magazines and books. Taylor decided to move to the next room. She lost quite some time trying to break into the house. She would need to start hurrying a bit more if she wants to find out the truth about Anne. Taylor walked quickly but silently to the next room. It was a very large bathroom. Taylor had never seen such a luxurious bathroom. This space was in stark contrast to the previous dusty room. The old house turned out to be full of surprises, but then Taylor saw something that made her heart pound in her throat. At first glance, the bathroom seemed normal. Very luxurious, but still normal. But then Taylor noticed something shocking. She saw two of everything in the bathroom. 2 toothbrushes, 2 bathrobes, etc. Would Anne have kept her husband's things all those years? Or is there more going on here? Taylor realized in that moment that there might be a possibility that she wouldn't be alone in the house. This thought alone sent an icy shiver down her spine. She knew she had to be extra careful now, but it also gave her hope. She started to learn more and more about Anne. Meanwhile, Joe walked through the village looking for more information about Anne, her home, and her past. He soon learned that almost everyone knew Anne, and everyone who knew her had strong opinions about the old woman. She and her husband turn out to have an interesting past full of intriguing events. In a library, Joe finds an old man who is willing to tell more about this past. He tells her that for many years Anne and her husband were among the most important people in the village. Everyone knew them for their generosity and great impact on the village. They helped with community projects and helped everyone they could. Joe was surprised. This was a completely different impression than he got from Anne. The old man said that Anne's husband, Harold, was a well-known and successful banker. He had earned his money and power by working hard, but also by not always being honest with the rules. He made deals with the wrong people, which made himself very rich. In those early years, Harold was a feared man in the village. They knew they could get things done with him, but they feared the people he associated with. But despite his reputation, the authorities could do nothing against him. He had become too powerful. It caused Harold and Anne to have a bad reputation in the village. But a few years and several millions of dollars later, everything changed. A new man had come to live in the village that would have an even greater impact, turning Harold and Anne's lives upside down. The man was a pastor who would take over a church in the village. He soon learned of Harold's reputation and the problems it caused in the village. He understood that it was a big problem and decided to make it his personal mission to change this. The pastor Jack decided to visit Harold regularly. Jack was a charismatic man who easily made contact with many people. Harold was also quickly impressed by this new appearance in the village. They soon discovered that they shared many of the same hobbies, and an unusual friendship developed. During the many times Jack and Harold went out, Jack always took the opportunity to tell Harold about the Bible. After all, he was a pastor. He couldn't resist. Harold didn't like it much at first, but he had a soft spot for Jack, and at some point his words started to have an impact. Harold seemed calmer and decided to go straight more and more. After he finally converted, he decided to leave all his bad works behind and focus on the good. He and Anne decided to use their accumulated wealth to make a difference in the village. This is how they got their great reputation in the later years. But not everyone was happy with this. The criminals Harold used to work with were obviously not happy that Harold turned his life around. It also meant that he stopped working for them, which ruined their plans. They wanted to take revenge and make sure that someone else who would work with them would take over Harold's place. Thus, a shrewd plan was born to frame Harold. The criminals were smart and had the influence of like-minded people at the bank who helped them. This is how the rumors soon arose, and not much later an official charge against Harold about large-scale fraud. Harold had the wrong people against him, and he lost his case. He was put behind bars for 45 years. All this happened 20 years ago. It broke Anne's heart that she had now lost her husband. She was no longer that generous, cheerful woman. Instead, she began to live like a hermit. No one has ever entered her house since that day, and she limited contact with the people in the village. But there was a twist to the story, the librarian said. When Harold was in prison for 5 years, the big news came that he had escaped from prison. It soon turned out that he had crossed the border. The man has probably lived in South America since then. Joe was amazed. Why wouldn't Anne have flown that way too to live with him? The old man had an answer for that too. He explained that since that event, there has been a rumor that Harold has come back to the village to live with his wife. No one would expect to actually do something so risky, and the authorities have stopped the official investigation for years. But no one knew for sure, and they certainly didn't want to bring it up with Anne. Meanwhile in the house, Taylor wanted to walk on to the next room. But as she left the bathroom and walked up the landing to the next room, something happened that really startled her. When she opened the door, she got the shock of her life. Suddenly, she also came face to face with a strange man. Taylor let out a scream. Who is that man, and what is he doing here? The man is very elderly and has difficulty walking, but he immediately tried to calm Taylor down. Fortunately, Taylor quickly realized that the man had good intentions. Then the man said, "Please sit down, I'll explain everything to you." Then the man, who turned out to be Harold, pointed to a large leather chair in the room. Taylor sat down and the man began to speak. He told her the whole story. He convinced Taylor that he was innocent and that he had the best intentions. Years ago, he had to make the difficult decision to return, knowing that he would never be able to leave this house. Taylor was shocked but also relieved. Anne wasn't a criminal, and neither was her husband. But how was this to go on? Anne would be fit for the secret to get out, and Taylor has quite a bit to explain as to why she broke into the house. And Joe, as far as Taylor knew of course, didn't know anything yet. Meanwhile, Joe came home and saw a note on the table. It said, "Honey, I know you'd never let me, but if you're looking for me, I'll probably be at Anne's house." Joe was shocked, and it got worse when he looked outside, because there he saw Anne approaching. She was almost at the door to enter. But when Anne opened the door and walked into the house, to her great surprise, Harold and Taylor were talking in the living room. Her jaw dropped in astonishment, and she dropped everything she had in her hands. By now, Joe had also arrived at the door to see if there was any way he could help Taylor. How were they supposed to explain this? Fortunately, Harold immediately spoke up and told Anne that he had signaled to Taylor to come in. He said that he had a great need for more human contact.